whatever the event is, you've made a fine choice with Mike. He's one of the best in the field. Now, given my respect for David, I was tempted today to just read those two sentences to you and let my introduction end there. And then I thought, some of you might not know David. Some of you who know him might not like him. And so I better speak for myself about Michael's accomplishments and contributions. And let me begin with my bottom line. Michael Jacobson has been a trailblazing thought leader in advancing the cause of incarceration reform for years, combining rich insights gained as a practitioner with the discipline of a serious scholar. He earned his PhD in sociology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and in 1984 launched the first stage of his career, one characterized by his rapid rise through a series of important positions in New York City government, including Deputy Budget Director. He explained that to me last night. He started out by focusing on criminal justice programs within the budget office, probation commissioner, and correction commissioner, actually holding both of those positions for a period of time simultaneously. He left the correction commissioner's position in 1998 to accept a faculty position at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He held that position until 2005, when he became the president of the Vera Institute of Justice. It was in that same year, 2005, that his pioneering book, Downsizing Prisons, was published by the New York University Press. Its subtitle is How to Reduce Crime and End Mass Incarceration. And remember that this is about a decade before public interest and the attention of policymakers really started beginning directed to these issues in a big way. The substance of the book is described in its jacket cover in the following way. After overseeing New York City's jail system, the largest in the country, Michael Jacobson knows firsthand the inner workings of the correction system. In this book, he convincingly argues that mass incarceration will not, as many have claimed, reduce crime or create more public safety. Simply put, throwing away the key is not the answer. Instead, Jacobson argues that our prison system needs a massive overhaul. Moreover, given the dire budget shortfalls facing most states, there really is no choice. We no longer have the revenue to continue prison expansion while simultaneously supporting education, health care, and lower taxes. I guess back then, Mike, you, like many of the rest of us, didn't realize how easy it actually would be for some politicians to sacrifice education and health care to invest more in prisons. In 2013, Mike returned to the City University of New York to help found the Institute for State and Local Governance, which he now directs. Though his responsibilities may be more expansive, he has remained committed to the same system improvement goals when it comes to criminal justice. In supporting New York City's criminal justice investment initiative, he put it this way: Around the country, local governments and communities are taking a fresh look at problems affecting our justice system. And people from diverse perspectives are all looking for ways to make our justice system better. From preventing people from entering the justice system at all, to making sure people are treated fairly when they do become involved, to making sure they succeed after they leave the system. As we continue on that journey, Mike, we're very pleased that you're here to share some of your distinctive thoughts with us. Please join me in welcoming Michael Jacobson.
There's plenty of room here. I don't know what all the whining is.
Fred's always complaining.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Mark, for that lovely introduction. I should say I have a couple of jobs here. For the few minutes I'll be talking, and I'll gonna sort of power through a lot of I do have PowerPoints, but I know it's kind of late in the day for PowerPoints. I'm gonna get through them quickly and try to wind up with some very sort of specific words about strategy and fiscal strategy and Pittsburgh. So I'm not going to talk about New York much for a couple of reasons. It's not my job on this particular panel. I will talk about it for a minute, but also what I have ringing in my ears is when I became the director of the Vera Institute, one of our advisors was a guy named Tom Ross, and Tom was at the time the Chief Judge of the North Carolina Judiciary, later went on to become the Chancellor of the North Carolina University System. He now runs a place called the Volcker Alliance. Anyhow, one of the things he said to me when he was giving me advice upon my taking this job was, if you listen to one thing I say, just remember this. When you're outside New York City, don't ever talk to anyone about New York City. No one cares. Just move on. So, I mean, of course, I'm going to talk about New York City anyhow, but still, I always have that in the back of my head, so I get it. So, what I'm going to try to do initially, and really quickly, because I know a lot of you folks know, and some of you sort of live in this world, is just to put a little bit of national context around some of the discussions today, and specifically the reform work that you folks from Pittsburgh are doing, and then sort of rapidly drill down into some local examples, and then end with some thoughts from a relative outsider around what Pittsburgh is doing. So quickly, and again, people have seen this in a variety of ways. The reason I wanted to start out with this, so this goes back to 1990. I could have made it from 1980. It just would have been too crowded a graph. The reason I wanted to show this is just to reemphasize 2 points that I think most people know. One is these are national figures, UCR figures. This is violent crime. It's been cut by half. In the last 25 years, if you were looking at national victimization survey data, it would be even more, but we have substantial reductions in crime in the U.S., and you'll see this, the blue line are arrests, and I wanted to put that on here, and you'll see it's minus 20%. It's actually minus 20% just since 2008 or 9. Right, so there's been, from over 12 million to under 10 million. These are adult arrests, would be even more if you count the juveniles. I wanted to put that up there because it sets some of the context and reinforces a lot of the points that you've heard from various speakers and Danielle about cutting off the faucet and the power of the front end. We have had, for a variety of reasons, too long and complicated to talk about here, a pretty dramatic decrease in arrest activity in the U.S. And one of the things that's resulted in And again, people have seen this a million times. The top line is prison. The bottom is jail. This, again, starts in 1990, could have gone to 1980, and you could have added another 100% to these numbers. But, you have this long 3 or 4 decade trend, seemingly immutable growth. Both jails and prisons start to decline. Not hugely, but 7, 6, 5% over the last several years. So on the one hand, those are marginal reductions. They're not huge. That it happens to a chart like this, by definition, hides all sorts of regional and local differences. So it's a little bit meaningless in some ways, other than the fact that this curve is bending, even relatively slightly. And again, in places like New York, California, other places, it's much more than slightly, is hugely important. I mean, hugely important because even marginal changes in these numbers affect tens of thousands of people, so that's a good thing. But also because between these numbers, between the crime decline, I think the importance really is that it creates a moment for historical reform in the U.S. We are in, I don't know if we're in the middle, but we are in a historical moment where serious criminal justice reform is possible. It's happening around the country. And I should say, even though tables like this really sort of disguise this fact, this, and I do this too, I sort of talk about this as a national issue, and it is a national issue in a lot of ways. But the thing about criminal justice is it's not just a local issue, it's a hyper-local issue, right? People will say, my students will say all the time, correctly, this is the civil rights issue of our time. It is. And what makes it especially complicated is it has to be sort of solved locally, right, in 3,000 counties in 50 states. There's no easy piece of federal legislation that's going to deal with a lot of the issues we talk about today. That's why the local stuff, the stuff you're doing and working on, is so incredibly important, not only for this place, but to sort of inform the field, to show best practice, to get other people to do what you're doing. That's both the obstacle and the challenge, and the reward for doing the kind of work you're doing. I put this chart up here. Sean Bushway sort of raised this. This is a chart from the report on the Council of Criminal Justice that just came out by Bill Sable. I'm not really going to talk about it. It shows changes in black-white incarceration rates over the years. And what's interesting to me about this chart is that, there have been some improvements in the black-white incarceration rate in the last 10 or 15 years, still sort of horrible disparities, right? So this is nothing at all to write home about, but the reason I think it's important to look at is, at least for me, what this chart says, even though a lot of these changes, I'm sure, were unintentional, this is the power of those arrest numbers going down, right? This, when you start to significantly turn off the spigot, and those arrest numbers that I showed you going down, those are not just low-level misdemeanor arrests going down. Those are serious violent arrests going down for all sorts of reasons. There's less crime, there's changing policing practices. But when you do that, when you really deal seriously at the front end, even though, again, this is in large measure probably an unintended consequence of those, you can see what the power of this is. And so to me, this is rather than being a good news story, it really isn't, but it does sort of point to what localities can do as you think not only about how you reduce jail populations, but how you tackle racial and ethnic disparities, because those disparities start with what's bought into the system, and that's law enforcement. Okay, so I quickly want to put up this chart, which we just went over at the criminology meetings in San Francisco. So this is, you'll see, you may say to yourself, what city is Site A? Well, we're not telling you. So these are the first two cohorts of MacArthur sites, right? So Pittsburgh, you are not on here, right? You're in the third cohort, so don't look for yourself here. You're not here. There are collegial cities that you may deal with that are on this chart. The reason I'm showing it is the MacArthur experience so far is, I mean, overall, when you look, it's pretty good. Some of the sites have really had substantial decreases, 20% or larger. Some sort of in the middle, decreases, I would say nothing to write home about, but better than nothing. And then you have a few that are obviously challenged. But what this does show, and you can have a game guessing who some of these sites are. It does show the power at a local level when people get together with this goal of what can be done, because some of these are really pretty substantial. Okay, I said I wasn't going to talk about New York. I'm really not, but I did. What I wanted to show, and Liz will have a much more sort of detailed look at this. Two things that are sort of interesting about New York. One, the gold line, that's the 77%, it's probably closer to 80% reduction in violent crime over the last 25 years. And also, certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, a massive decline in arrests. The problem with this table, actually, is it lumps all arrests together. If I broke it out between felony and misdemeanor, you'd see felony arrests have been declining in New York City for 25 years. So I should have done that. I'm not sure why I didn't. That's probably some staff member's fault. Yeah, someone will pay for this. So the three interesting things about New York City, and this will be true for the other sites I go over quickly, right? You have again this very substantial shutting off, especially for felony arrests. And Liz, I'm sure we'll talk about how a lot of that's happened, have declined. Crime has continued to decline, right? So clearly puts the lie to you need more enforcement and more enforcement to drive down crime. Obviously, that's not true. And then, again, the next slide, which Liz will probably take back even longer, but, this is the third part of the, quote-unquote New York miracle, right? While all arrests are down, crime is down, and this is the decrease in jail over that roughly 25 or 28-year period. So at that level, it's a complicated story in New York, but it's a good news story. And the 61% decrease is probably closer to 66 or 67% now as we go down. But the value of the New York story, even though I admit it would be better if it was a Dallas story, is that those three things are all happening together. And if you can reduce crime and reduce incarceration and reduce arrests all at the same time, why wouldn't you do that? It's just good public policy. I'll probably just sort of blow through these. I had a little about Cook, declining arrests, still crime, with crime going down in Cook, even though uptick in shootings a couple of years ago. This is the Cook story recently. You can see the decline in their jail population, down 31%. That was about a year and a half ago. Their jail population is now down about 50% from where they started. Again, Cook, same kind of story, a little different, hugely declining arrests. The jail population is declining, crime still, even though Chicago gets a lot of understandable press around its murder rate, but the trajectory of violent crime is going in the right direction. Multnomah, again, I'm doing this also to show that the huge variation in cities. Multnomah actually has been pretty steady in arrests over time. Their crime rate, like most places, down significantly. And you can see Multnomah, not quite like New York, but has had this 15-year ongoing reduction in jail. So you have all these cities, you're now about to join them, where you have this sort of trajectory of less enforcement, right? Fewer arrests, less imprisonment, and less crime. And that, from my point of view, should be everyone's goal. Okay, so let me switch now for a couple of minutes just to talk about the strategies that we see, both from the literature and from our experience being one of the MacArthur partners that do all the sort of data analytics and research work for that initiative. Here what we call sort of high impact strategies. And I should say, one of the reasons I'm showing this, and this isn't at all necessarily true of Pittsburgh. When we first started the MacArthur initiative, one of the things that we saw pretty frequently initially, we see less of this now when we were sort of dealing with sites about how they were going to reduce their jail population, what they wanted to do. There was a lot of sort of low-level diversion. And that's a good thing. I mean, you low-level folks shouldn't be in jail. It's good to divert them. That's a good public policy goal. It rarely gets you sort of big numbers, right? So what gets you big numbers are big system changes. That's where you have to sort of spend your time and energy. It's the most difficult and the most challenging, but it will get you where you need to be ultimately. And so, these are sort of three of the big ones. I've been talking about reducing arrests. There's all sorts of enforcement you can do that's still enforcement. It's just not arrests, right? You can do summonses in lieu of arrests. You can write tickets. You can make all sorts of things violations. You can move stuff from the criminal court to the civil court. There's a lot of ways to enforce things, right? We as a country tend to have defaulted to both arrest and incarceration. That's our default. And it's clear now, both from practice and the literature, that it's not remotely necessary to do that. So reducing arrests is both one of the sort of premier ways to lower your jail population, actually lower your prison population. There's sort of proof upon proof that it will not impact public safety if done correctly, but I recognize this is a challenge, right? And we know from the MacArthur work, this involves enforcement, especially city police agencies really taking a look in the mirror and doing stuff differently than they've done in the past. It's easy for me to talk about. I don't want to be sanguine about it. But you really can't get from here to there without at some point taking on this issue. And we know that you can. In fact, arrests and bookings are sort of down here, right, in Pittsburgh. My quick look at the data shows that, well, that's a good thing. It's been offset a little by increases in length of stay, especially from this probation detainer population, which I'll talk about in a minute, right? The other tough thing, easy to talk about, speeding up case processing. The iron law of correction populations it's all determined by how many come in and how long they stay, right? That's where you gotta go. And the how long they stay piece is pretty key. Pittsburgh, you've had some pretty large increases in length of stay, which tends to offset your reductions in arrests. It's always complicated. It's usually political. It's not easy to do, but if you want big numbers, if you want to get traction, you have to be able to make those reductions in case processing. And, that's really living in the muck of judicial processing. How many continuances are there? Why are cases continuously continued? Why are there 4 weeks as opposed to 1 week between those continuances? Are there firm trial dates? I mean, this is all very tough stuff. It goes to the heart of judicial discretion, which is, will always engender some tough discussions with the judiciary. But you sort of can't, again, you can't get from here to there without really tackling these length of stay issues. The other thing that's on here for obvious reasons is bail reform of all kinds, whether it's getting rid of cash bail, as Danielle said, or increasing your ROR rates. There's ample evidence out there that diverting huge numbers of people from being remanded in the first place is a sort of winning strategy. And again, when you look at your system, and your system is no different in this way than most other systems, I think when I looked, it was something like 43% of your jail population is out within 10 days, and a big chunk of it is out within 3 days. I mean, it's not unusual. That sort of happens with as people make phone calls, they get bail, they get out. There's no public safety or public policy purpose of having people in jail for 3 or 4 days. I mean, there just isn't. There's no, you can't justify it. And I must say, it's easy. I struggled with this when I was running the jail system. I was remarkably unsuccessful about dealing with it because it involves poverty and bail and how people pay bail. But getting those folks out of your system, never letting them come in the first place, is a huge issue. And I'll just say a word now about Pittsburgh in particular. It's not in particular. Philadelphia has the same issue. It's actually a state issue here. One of your strategies for the MacArthur work is to deal with probation violators and detainers, and when I look at it, it all makes sense. To me, and I realize the sort of empty nature of what I'm about to say, because I'm not from here, I get the politics probably are horrible. This requires legislation. You just have too many people on probation here for too long. From any public policy, public safety point of view, it's just ludicrous. You can't possibly, other than politics, you can't justify that. All the research is in on this. There's no debate. There's no need. Maybe there's a person or two who needs to be on probation for 5 years, but practically no one needs to be on probation for 5 years or 3 years for a misdemeanor. Right? All the research will say once the first 9, 12, 15 months, you're good to go. It's a way to downsize probation. It's a way to get probation some more resources, to do some more interesting work, and it's a way to keep people out of your system. Violating someone on probation for a technical violation who's been on probation for 3 years, you might as well just take money and burn it. There's no, you just can't justify it. And I know I'm sort of talking to the choir here, and I know as a strategy, you're sort of trying to deal with that through a lot of the work you're doing with probation officers and violations. In the end, I would argue you have to take their discretion away. That is the way you have to go. You just have to shrink the times you have on probation, and you have to limit excessively what someone could ever go back to jail or prison for a technical violation. On the one hand, it's sort of a mundane thing. On another hand, it's hugely important. The sort of Meek Mill case has raised this issue a lot. There's a lot of sort of ferment around it, especially in this state. But again, I would argue for this county, ultimately, you do really good work. You'll make your MacArthur targets, I predict. But if you really want to get down, there's no way to not sort of take this issue on in a very direct way. My last point here is just, some version of what I was saying before. These are smart, good things to do. Diversion, specialized course, courts, warrant resolution, all good public policy. But if you're putting together strategies where you need big numbers, these can be a sort of small part of them, but you're never going to get 40, 50, 60% decreases, which I argue you should be able to do simply with these kinds of policies, because you need systemic reform, especially at the front end. And for that, you need both law enforcement, and then maybe a final word on prosecution. And I'll take off on a point Danielle made. There's a lot of work going on in the country now, because there are these whole host of progressive prosecutors, when obviously You have a pretty high profile one in Philadelphia, but there are a number of around the country. And our institute, along with Loyola and the Florida International University, are doing a lot of work with a lot of these prosecutors on redefining what their performance metrics are, right? Because the days for prosecutors of measuring their success, either substantively or politically, around number of indictments, number of convictions, right? Those days should and hopefully will be over, right? There are a new crop of prosecutors who are incredibly interested in other ways to measure what they do, whether it's diversion, whether it's decline to prosecute rates, whether it's recidivism, getting people into programs. There's a whole slew of ways you can think about to measure prosecutorial activity that are not simply how many people do we convict, how many people do we send to state prison. It's an interesting number to count, but it misses all kinds of sort of nuance and public safety issues. The final thing I'll say, and this is certainly true for Pittsburgh, but I sort of say this wherever I go, and it always pisses people off, but that's but I have tenure, so I just keep saying it. It's important for me. Well, so a couple of things. One is, you, the royal you, not just you, have to think about sort of sustainability. You get a lot of MacArthur money, that's going to end. You get a lot of Hines money, that's going to end. At the end of the day, all the stuff that funds to sort of shrink your system, to reorient your system, to have a better, more thoughtful, more just, more racially equitable system, that's a government function. I mean, if that's doesn't belong to government, then nothing belongs to government, right? So again, you, the royal you, are going to have to find ways to keep this going. So to the extent you really need that MacArthur money or that Hines money for whatever it is, whether it's more public defenders or program staff or data people, to the extent those are necessary for you to keep achieving reductions, you have to think about how that's going to be sustained after these things are over. And I always argue, Mark said, I was a budget official for a long time. I ran the same agencies that I cut as a budget official. I don't know what I did in some prior life to deserve that, but I've been on sort of both sides of these issues. I think you have to force the money out of your corrections agencies. You just have to force it out. And when I say that, what I mean is you can't wait for the savings to happen. There's no sort of natural, organic way, even if your population goes down, that savings magically appears. It never works that way. There are all sorts of needs, legitimate needs, that jails and prisons have, and they're happy to spend that money in a variety of ways. A lot of them may make a lot of sense. But I think when you put your budgets together, when you do your 2, 3, 4-year fiscal plans, you have to make some pretty tough assumptions about where you want to be. And if you've cut your population by 10%, if you're confident you'll get it to 20%, then don't wait for 20% to try to realize budget savings. And it's, this is complicated. This has nothing to do with the average cost. This is all about marginal savings and figuring that out and figuring out what kind of capacity you have to close to get savings. Is it a unit? Is it a pod? Do you save overtime? Do you save straight time? And it's not rocket science, but it's a lot of work. But the one piece of advice I'd give you, and again, it's tough stuff, but I think it's sort of axiomatic. The money, I tend to think of these agencies, and I've run these agencies, in addition to everything else, they're sort of big banks. Right? There's a lot of money in these agencies. You do not need to be spending all the money you're spending in them. You need to figure out a way to not just cut them and sort of increase overcrowding and have the same number of people for smaller dollars, right? I was always okay as a correction leader if OMB cut my budget, but it was commensurate with a reduction in population, and I could sort of close areas or wings or even a whole jail. I sort of got why that would happen. And again, I know this is easy to say and it's tough stuff, but my strong advice, both because I think it's the right thing to do. It's the right way to fund a lot of these initiatives. It makes sense to think about sustainability in resource-constrained times, is that you don't leave the money there and wait for it to appear. You have to be sort of aggressive, make some assumptions, make sure you live up to those assumptions, and take the money out as your population is going down. I don't want to overstate the complexity of this, either the political complexity or the substantive complexity. It can be done. It's a good exercise, and localities should do it. I think it's hugely important. And I'll just end with, I'm pretty familiar with your strategies here and what everyone's working on, really, and it's incredibly impressive. You should be really proud of the work you're doing. You're clearly one of the leaders in the cohort, if not the leader in the cohort you're in from MacArthur. It's really impressive both how many people you sort of get, not just to come to these things, but to work together. The data that you put out, your public-facing data, whether it's your dashboards or reports, are really, really impressive. I'm pretty familiar with all the 52 cities, jurisdictions that MacArthur works in. Almost no one has this kind of data. So it's really, there's a lot of good news here. I would just, counsel you to the extent I can to really, be aggressive, go big. Take on issues like probation and budget issues. You have a moment here, right? The door is open for reform. You never know how long that door will be open, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us and all of you to walk through it. Thank you.